Today is May 19th, 2006. I am Sarah Locker. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Linton, North Dakota. Can you state your full name, including your maiden name?
My name is Valeria, and my maiden name is Wagner.
And your married last name?
Mine is Sehn, S-E-H-N. People have a hard time
pronouncing it.
that.
Can you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in Strasbourg, in the Krosna area, southwest of Strasbourg, on my grandparents' farm, where my parents lived at the time. I was born in the sod house. That's where I grew up and went to school.
Were you ever told any stories about your birth?
Yes, it was a hard birth, and my mom thought she'd never make it through the ordeal, but everything went all right. It was just a long delivery, and my aunt talked about it later on when I was about 15 years old by then, and I used to stay at her house and babysit for her and help her taking care of Grandma. And then we talked about deliveries one day, and she said, "Never forget when you were born. Mine," she said, "you were ugly." And she was so worried because my forehead was pushed back and my top of my head was pointed because it was a hard, long delivery. And those days they didn't have the technology they have now. So I thought, I'm glad that one turned out okay.
Was your aunt the one there to help your mother, or was there a midwife too?
She was still home, and she lived on the farm with Grandma yet. She was the second youngest in the family, Aunt Regina.
Okay.
And so she remembered that. And I guess she was close to my dad, and then she was kind of waiting for the delivery and see what it was going to be and all that. And we were always close, Aunt Regina and I, because she was only 9 years older than I am. And as we grew up, she was married, but I would help her a lot. And then Grandma stayed at her house when she was older, and Aunt Regina took care of her until she died. So that was kind of interesting.
Are you the oldest child?
I am the oldest one in our family, right.
How did the birth for your little brothers and sisters, was that easier or harder on your mother?
It was easier later on. She usually had a rough time. And then my baby brother was born in 1939, and that was a hard delivery. Our local pastor, Father Selder, was there at the time, and he said there was no reason for your little brother to die if your mom only would have been in Bismarck for a cesarean. He could have been saved.
By that time they had it.
Yeah, and it was such a long labor period, and he suffocated in the fluids. That's what happened, he said.
Is that
Mom never talked about it, and that's how it was in those days. They didn't want to say much. Mm-hmm. But I knew it was hard, and I kind of felt something went wrong, just the way my dad responded to the loss of his little son.
How old were you when this happened?
I was about 16.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you share some of your earliest memories?
Oh, my earliest memories, let's see, they were mostly about Grandma, and then at home too. Had to take a lot of responsibilities for a young child, you know. And being the oldest one in the family, it was always, if something went wrong, well, you're the oldest one. You should have noticed that, or you should have known. And I thought, later on when I got older, I thought that was really hard.
You were basically the second mother to everybody else?
To everybody else. And then way later on, after we were all married already, and sometimes you get back to some of these old stories. And one of my sisters said, "You were so strict when Mom and Dad left, you know, we just couldn't do anything." And I always kind of talked to her and tried to explain. And one day I said to her, "You know, if you'd have been the oldest one, you'd have known what it was like when you have to take the responsibility." When Mom came home, and then it was me, she would ask, and, "Well, why did you do this?" or "What happened here?" and whatever. And if anything wasn't under control or exactly right or messed up, and then it was your fault. You should have known. You were the older one. You're in charge. Well, I said, if you'd have been in charge, what would you have done? I said to my sister. Then she finally kind of realized that, yeah, maybe they did have more responsibility.
I suppose. Do you remember a situation that you were in charge and your parents came home and were either upset or happy with how you handled the kids?
Usually they'd go to town on a Saturday, and then some of the house cleaning was left for us to do. And the old stovepipes, you remember these black ones that go through the kitchen or whatever and out the chimney? And then if that wasn't dusted, it just seemed like Mom would walk in and look at that stovepipe, and if that wasn't dusted, I forgot the stovepipes again today. And so that would be one thing you'd get bawled out for. And then other things, if the floor wasn't scrubbed right or was streaky or whatever, and that was a mistake, everything just had to be perfect. You didn't get lazy, you had to do it good or go and do it again. So that was one thing that I know she watched really close. And then there were other things too. Then we had to sometimes fix a dessert or something for Sunday and bake a cake. And that went pretty good then, as far as that was concerned. So,
well, let's talk about your family a little more. Let's start with your grandparents on your dad's side. Do you remember them? What they were like?
Very much. When I was old enough to start school, they had moved into town. My parents lived on the farm with them a year, and Grandma and Grandpa were building a home at that time. And when the home was finished, they moved into town, which was about a year after their marriage. And when I started school, Grandma said I should come stay with them and go to St. Ben's. So my first 2 years of schooling was at St. Ben's at a Catholic school at Strasbourg. And so after those 2 years were up, and then we went to the country school, and my next sister was old enough. So Grandma figured Dad could haul 2 kids to school instead of just going for one, which I am very thankful for, because the nuns, they were the best teachers. Some people don't like to hear that, but I'm sorry. They are the best teachers. They're just like your next set of parents. You have to do right, and you had to do your homework, and everything had to be perfect. You had to learn to teach your prayers. They would teach us. And then on Fridays, we had an hour, which was playtime. And then they would teach us how to crochet or knit or all of these things that you use later on in life. And as far as my education, we had to learn the alphabets, then we had to learn how to pronounce them, and then we went into words. You had flashcards, which somewhere along the line they didn't want to use flashcards anymore. Well, you have to memorize everything. Well, if you can't remember, you're in trouble. And so that I was always a good speller. And I think all through my years, there was my dad, my sisters. When I got married, there was my husband. How do you spell this? How do you spell that? I would just mostly all the time spell it. Once in a while, there was a word that's a little bit complicated. Then I'd have to write it out and make sure that it was right. But I helped more people with their spelling than I ever thought I would. And then also in reading. We read a lot, and we learned how to read well. And I still like to read. If I can get an interesting article, my housework suffers. There's no other way. Just has to lay and wait till I'm done. And I used to think, what a waste of time. Here I sit reading instead of doing housework. One of my homemakers called one time on a Saturday, and she asked what I was doing, if I was finished with my work. I said, well, I don't know. I ran into something interesting here, and I'm sitting here reading, and my work is laying, vacuum cleaning in the middle of the room. Oh, she says, that's no waste of time. You have to do that, she said. And she also was a person that read a lot.
Did you appreciate the nuns while you were a child? Were you appreciative of them?
I did. They were very nice to me. I did what they wanted me to do, and they were just like a mom to me. And the second grade teacher was a little strict, but I knew she was strict, so I made sure I didn't get into mischief. And I had no problem with her. I was never punished. And we had good students. I still remember some of the students that went to school. And often over the years here, I thought, I wonder if they remember that we were in the same grades when we were young. And many of them did remember that we were in the same grade. And there's Andy Schumacher still living in Linton here and went to second grade that year when I was there. Then there was Maggie Werner, John's wife. She was from Strasbourg and she went to school there. And Albert Wagner was another one. Albert even asked my husband one time, wondered if I remembered that we went to school together, first and second grade. That was kind of a nice feeling after about 40 years, they still remembered what had happened then. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did appreciate their help. And up to now, I have so often thought what a good thing that was that I could have that.
And you would have started school only speaking German, right?
Yes.
How was that?
And that was kind of tough. I remember once in a while writing, I will never speak German again. But we did anyway. Got away from the teacher. I would rattle off and, oh, here she is, be careful. But, and that was even out in the country school where you still had a tendency to speak German. That always came easier. Up to now, when I talk to some of my older friends and I have something that we're talking about from years ago, I'll end up saying it in German. And some of them will, oh, you still speak German? Well, yeah, why wouldn't I? I'm never going to give that up.
I can see why those memories are in German instead of in English.
And a lot of times you say something in German, it sounds a lot more comical because it fits better. That's what it was meant for, I guess, or where it came from.
It doesn't translate.
Yeah, right.
Did your parents ever learn to speak English well?
They did, and they spoke English quite well. Dad more so than Mom. But Mom she went to school to the third grade. And she could write. And her spelling, she had a little problem, but she realized that she didn't know how to spell that word. And I helped her a lot there. And sometimes she wanted to write to her sister that was in the convent. And for Christmas or so, she'd want to write herself. Otherwise, I had to do most of the writing for her. But she did well. And even if she wasn't sure how it was spelled, she could do it well enough so you could make out what she was talking about. And my dad had a little trouble with spelling too, but he knew the meaning of the words. He had a dictionary, which he would use a lot. And he was interested in community affairs and whatever. He was clerk on the school board for many years and took care of those books. He was treasurer or whatever. And was active in church affairs and all that. And they didn't have a organization out in Crossmouth area, southwest of Strasbourg, for the women. And the men didn't either, where in every church they have an organization for each one of the groups, And we didn't have that out there. They had a youth group when we grew up, because then the bishop wanted that. And Father Selder said, we're not going to get together that often, he said, but I'll need somebody to be treasurer and whatever, president. And he asked if he could put our names down. And we would meet occasionally through the year, maybe 2 or 3 times, and he would talk to us and tell us what was right and wrong and all that. But other than that, we didn't have regular meetings. Because really didn't pay to have it, because we had no community hall that was big enough to use for events and invite a lot of people from the surrounding areas.
Let's go back to your grandparents again. What were the names of your grandparents on your father's side?
My dad's father was Thomas Wagner, and he was born in Russia and then came to America. And Grandma was, her maiden name was Brickner, Natalia Brickner. and her parents were Rosina Schreiner and what was Grandpa's name now? Harry, but it was really Hieronymus. And some people say Hieronymus is Jerome, but it isn't. All the way through, the people that were named Hieronymus were called by the name of Harry. After they came to America, it was always Harry. And it does relate that way, I think. And so that's who my grandparents were, yeah, on Dad's side.
Can you tell me what type of person your grandfather and grandmother were on your dad's side?
Grandma was very talented. She could do anything. She could knit. Oh, she knit. The needles just went. You couldn't keep track and look how she did it because she went too fast. But she knitted all the socks and mittens for her family and was a good seamstress. She would take old coats, turn them inside out, and make new clothing for the little ones. Trousers, the same thing. And Grandma was very kind, I found her to be. When I stayed with them that winter, after supper she'd sit down and knit or darn socks or something like that, and I did my homework. And one of my aunts was home, and she taught school at the public school when I was a first and second grader. And she always helped me with my homework and saw that I did everything. And after I was done, I could sit with Grandma, and I asked her questions all the time. And we would talk about Russia, and she would tell me what went on over there and how life was. And if they went out for the evening, play cards, I got to go along. But, that was hard, going to school the next day. They usually went home at about 10:30, but still, it was later than my regular bedtime. But, yeah, and Grandpa was... he was kind of a gentle guy. I never saw him get mad or bawl out other people, criticize or what a whole lot. He would talk about what they did and shouldn't have done, but he never got angry, as far as I know. He went through the 8th grade for education in Russia before they came to America, Grandpa. And the way I remember, and I remember them saying that he even taught school for a year or so. Then he went to work for farmers. He liked farm labor better.
And he taught school in the U.S. or in Russia?
In Russia, yeah, for a little bit. One of my cousins had mentioned that too, that their mom talked about it. And that's about all I remember. He would come out to the farm and discuss things with my dad. My dad was kind of his supporter. If he needed help with anything. And then during the drought years, they had a hard time paying their taxes and all that. So he'd always come and ask Dad what to do.
What kind of stories did your grandmother share with you about Russia?
We mostly talked about what they used to cook, the foods. And it was like all the other Russians, noodles. One day she'd always say, we had noodles and potatoes, and the next day we had potatoes and noodles. Just turned it around. And they would make their noodles with, sometimes they had fruit with it, and the next time they'd have sauerkraut in noodles with potatoes. And then they had their own meat. They would butcher their hogs and beef and whatever, and they didn't have deep freezes like we do now, so they had to either can and you did a lot of canning, my grandma. She always had her shelves in the cellar with canned goods. And then she mentioned too that their homes were small, and in Russia they had a lot of trouble with the theft. The thieves would come and take their horses at night or take a good cow. And so she said you had to keep them in the barn at night. So the home was here and the barn was built onto the home, and they had their cattle right next to their homes. Otherwise they would lose them. And I thought that was kind of mean. If you take other people's horses, just like taking our cars now.
Yeah,
and then they raised their own gardens, and they had fruit orchards, They raised their own fruit.
What kinds of fruit they have?
grapes a lot, and then apricots they would talk about, and some apples. And that they missed when they came over here because it was colder. They couldn't raise that here.
Did your grandfather share any stories with you about Russia?
Grandpa Wagner didn't very much. He mostly enjoyed talking to Dad when he came, and he wasn't like my Grandpa Mitzel. My sister and I would be grinding grain on a Saturday or Friday, and they'd come out to the farm, Grandma and Grandpa Mitzel. And Grandpa Mitzel talked a lot. He was always visiting, and we were listening.
What kind of stories would he share?
I really can't remember a whole lot of them anymore, but he would tell us how also with their gardening and their wheat, how they had to cut it and tie it by hand. And then when they thrashed it, a lot of times they'd put it down and walk on it, to thrash it out, and then lift it up pour it from one bucket to the other and let the wind blow out the chaff and whatever was in it. The dust and all that.
So it was a good thing the wind is blowing the stuff out.
Yes,
okay.
They like that 40-hour wind, I guess, that we get here. Probably not that strong, but it would have to be, quite breezy to blow all that out, the dry stuff and whatever. And he talked about how it was when they came to America then, how they had a struggle with their crops, and trying to get a home established when they got here, get a home built, because there was no extra buildings out there. They had to start out with just practically nothing. And he settled down east of Strasbourg, my Grandpa Mitzel. They were east of Strasbourg, and Grandpa Wagner was west of Strasbourg. And they both had sod houses first to live in, and then Grandpa Wagner built his wood frame home when they moved into Strasbourg in 1922. 23 they moved in, I guess.
They were tired of farming?
Yeah, and my parents got married in 22, and then they stayed, after a year, they moved into town, and my parents stayed on the farm.
So you lived with your grandma and Grandpa Mitzel for a year?
Wagner.
Wagner. Okay, Wagner.
Mm-hmm. And, for a year. And then they moved into town.
Were either of your sets of grandparents religious?
Both of them were very religious. And that's where they spend, I think, most of their time, is helping build the church and then help with community work through the church, and always going to church a lot too, and their families were brought up Catholic, all of them.
And how many children did each of them have?
Grandma Wagner had 10 children. Yeah, Grandma Wagner had 11. And then Grandpa Mitzel had 10 or 11 also, but they had two or three that died in infancy. And then another one died when she was a few years old. I don't know exactly just how old she was. And that younger one that died of Grandpa Mitzel's, she at one time, and I don't really know how it all happened, but they always said Grandma was out helping with the chores, and the 3 younger children were in the house, or 4 younger ones. My mom and the 3 younger sisters she had. And then this Johanna was her name. It was cold that day, and she was cold. She complaining she's cold. And then one of them opened the oven door in the cook stove, and they sat her on there. And she burned her little behind. And when she screamed, they took her off, but she had quite some burn, I guess. And I'm not too sure whether she died from that then, or whether she recovered, but she died when she was about 3-4 years old. Wow. I always think of that, and I thought, wow, what a misery that must have been.
Because there wasn't a whole lot of medical help she
No,
could have gotten.
not at all. Yeah.
Wow. Were there any other great aunts, uncles, family members of that generation that you were in touch with?
With all of them. I knew all my aunts and uncles on both sides, and we got together quite often for weddings. And my Aunt Katie on my mom's side, she was a real party lady. She liked get-togethers, family, and all her nieces and nephews would always be invited to most of her weddings. And also she celebrated her 80th birthday and then her 90th. And she was 91, I think, when she died. So we'd always get together and celebrate.
What would you do when you all got together as a family?
Mostly visit, and usually had somebody to provide some music and then dance, whoever wanted to dance. But it was really funny. Most people sat around and wanted to talk, and they'd always get away from the dancing floor because it was too noisy there. And Aunt Katie had it really set up nice. She had her celebration at Mobridge, and then there was a dining area where we had eaten, and we could visit there, and the dance floor was off into another room, just right next. And so the music didn't interfere, but most people were over there visiting, catching up with everything. It was just really interesting.
What kind of foods would be at these gatherings when you were a child?
Mostly potatoes and meat, and then salads, fruit and vegetable salads. Mashed potatoes and gravy were a must, I think. Everybody wanted that. And homemade bread a lot of times, and sometimes they would buy the bread. But even for weddings, they made homemade bread. I don't know how in the world they ever did that. They made kuchen plus their homemade bread.
So it would take them a while of baking ahead of time.
Yeah. And then that's something you can't bake a whole week ahead of time. You had to do that a day or so before. And well, their kuchen would keep a little better, and they could keep that in a cooler area. Like we had a sod house where my grandma Wagner lived, and a summer kitchen. And so they would live in the summer kitchen in the summer time, and then if they needed a cooler place, that sod house was much cooler than the summer kitchen, because the summer kitchen was just an ordinary wood frame home and no insulation, I would imagine, those days. And then kuchen and bread was kept over at the sod house because that was always cooler in there. And stayed cool practically all summer until July or August to get that hot spell for days at a time. Then it would warm up some, but it was still cooler.
Much better than the summer kitchen.
Right. Oh, there it would get so hot it was just like walking into an oven sometimes, especially when you use the cook stoves.
Can you tell me a little more about your favorite aunt that you had mentioned earlier, the one you were close with?
She was very easy to get along with, and because she was younger than the others were, we shared a lot more. I learned a lot from her as life changes as you grow up, you know, from childhood to adolescent and on to adult. And she would talk more openly about having children and all that, and a lot of different things which your parents, they'll talk to you, your parents, if you question them all the time. But you don't always want to do that. And with Aunt Regina, once we got into the conversation, it just went on, you know, kind of automatically from one thing to the other.
Would you go to her more often if you had?
I did. If I wanted to know anything, I did go to her more often, right.
Did you have a cousin that you were closer with?
I did. Let's see, the third oldest daughter of my dad's family got married the same time my parents got married. And so their oldest child was born in July, and I was born in October. And we were just those 3 months apart. So we were always close. Aloysia, she was baptized, but I always called her Alicia. And we were always close when we were small, as we grew up, until now, too. Her parents also moved into Linton, and I got married into the Sehn family. So so I was at Linton already before they moved up. And so when her mother died in 82, she stayed with her dad. She and her dad lived alone for a while. And after her dad had to go to the nursing home, and then she moved to the apartments just across the alley from us here. And so we were neighbors. And that was 19 years ago. And over those years, we were even closer than we were because we had a better opportunity to get together. And her sister, Augie Vetter, and his wife took care of her. They would always help her with whatever help she needed. Otherwise, she was on her own. And Alicia had polio when she was about not quite 2 years old. And so she could never walk after that. There was no medication. And so she was always on crutches or in a little red wagon, and we'd pull her around the farmyard with us when we played. And so when she lived up here in the apartment, and then her sister would always come over every day. In the morning, put her shoes on and take them off in the evening and help her with whatever help she needed. And other than that, she would do her own. And from the beginning, when she moved up here, she could still use her crutches and stand up and do things. But eventually, she had to be just in the wheelchair, and standing got to be a problem. And she had knee surgery and all that. And during those 19 years, if Loretta and Augie wanted to go to a wedding or so, I always told them, just let me know, I'll help her, don't worry about it. And but we wouldn't tell Alicia, that we were planning and doing this. So Loretta would always tell her, well, you have to ask somebody to come because they're leaving. And so she would depend on me. And I went over and did a lot for her. And we would just get together sometimes for lunch. I'd take soup over there, and we'd have lunch, or else she would make soup and invite me to come and have lunch with her. We did that quite often over the years, which was fun. And we shared. Oh, man. I guess if we wouldn't have had each other, we maybe would have had to go to a head shrinker. And we always teased each other, too. Well, that was worth a lot. Now we could visit, And it just stayed with us. We never said anything to anybody else.
Wow, that is a really close relationship.
And it was great. Now she's at the nursing home, and I miss her. Mm-hmm. I used to look out the window, and I could see her light. And I always knew whether she was still up, and I kind of knew what she was doing. She had a lot of hobbies, just like I did. And I felt comfortable if she was okay, and very seldom that she'd go to bed before I did, and I was always up until 12 most of the time, and sometimes later. But yeah, she keeps herself busy.
That independence kind of came from her parents?
Oh, yes. And even now that she's at the nursing home, she hasn't given up. She's still hoping she can come home. And I guess they kept the apartment for her, kept paying rent. But they were wondering, too, how long it'll take until she decides she can't come home. But I think eventually she'll get used to it. And sometimes you don't get used to a new place. You just want that place you had, which is hard. I feel bad for her, because she was so independent. Oh, even the few months when she was home and couldn't hardly do anything for herself anymore, she tried so hard. If everybody would try that hard, I think our nursing homes would go out of business. Absolutely.
Was she like that as a child, if she was trying to do something?
Oh, yes. There was nothing she couldn't do if she could get to it. So she would be on her crutches or wheelchair by the kitchen table, wherever she had to be, or stove. And if she needed something, her little sisters and brothers, or later on nieces and nephews would help. And anybody that was around. You bring me this, it's over there, and you bring me that, and she would put it together. She was the best cook that you can run into. She made kuchen and everything, just like the rest of us.
Didn't let any of it stop her.
No way. And as far as making soups and whatever, there's nobody that could make that any better than she did.
Were there a lot of people that had polio when you were
There
a child?
I don't know how many there were, but there was another family at Strasbourg, Gwendolyn Fishers, that lived east of Strasbourg, and their son David went to school with our children at Emmett Central, and he was wearing braces, and he also was supposed to have had polio when he was younger. And he was somewhat older than Alicia, but still young enough where there wasn't a whole lot of medication, I guess. That was before penicillin came out. Yeah.
Interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
And oh, I said what those poor patients went through. Gosh.
Did she go to the doctor as a child, even though there wasn't medicine
That
for
I
it?
don't know, but I remember my mom saying they didn't know what she probably was to a local doctor that we had. We always had Dr. Vonnegut here, and maybe they went in to see him. I'm not sure if he was here then already though either. But Mom said nobody knew what it was. And they must have had some doctors here, and the doctors didn't have anything that would help, she said, or didn't even know what to do with it. And so they called it feverish illness, you know. She had a real high fever, and I guess that's one of the symptoms that comes with polio. Then it affects their muscles and whatever. She was really sick. They didn't think she'd make it through, but she recovered. And many people say, yeah, she's a little bit stubborn too sometimes, you know, once in a while somebody will say, and I always end up saying, yeah, but remember, if you'd have been on crutches since you're 2 years old, don't you think we would get a little stubborn and grouchy? I see myself, I got so grouchy sometimes I'd thrown the crutches at them, I think.
Where did these crutches come from? Did they buy them or did somebody make them?
They, I don't know, the ones I can remember looked like the ones they have now. Crutches, you know, they had shorter ones, they could adjust them to some extent, and every now and then she had to get a new set because they couldn't adjust them long enough anymore. But, yeah, they had those all these years that I can remember, and crutches have never changed in style. Isn't that funny? They're still made the same than the ones that I can remember from way back.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. Until yesterday I was at the clinic, and I had to have an EKG, and they had a bunch of crutches hanging on the wall, shorter ones, and there was one aluminum set in there, and the others were all wooden and pretty much shaped the same and put together like all the others were over all these years. And everything else has changed so drastically that you can't hardly believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. Let's talk about your father. When and where was he born?
He was born on the farm where my brother still lives, or where Grandpa homesteaded. And he was born in 1900, September 4th, at Krosna, and he was baptized there too. All the family was born at Krosna then after they were in America. And they lived in Krosna all their years, Grandma and Grandpa, until they moved to town, so they were all baptized at Holy Trinity. And that's where Dad grew up and went to school, where the church was in Krosna. I have a picture of it. And the church was there was at an intersection. The main road, which later on was sort of south of the Farm to Market Road. That was a good gravel road, though. And it was the main road when they first moved out there. And at that intersection, the church was to the northwest of that intersection. And on the south side of the road, in the corner, was the parish house. And then across the road to the east was a one-room schoolhouse where we all went to school, Dad and his family too. And then across the street to the north from the school, a Turnus family lived there, and that happens to be the grandparents to Leo, my husband. And so we always had fresh water for the school. We always go down to Turnus's and pick up our pail full of fresh water every day. And so that was handy. And so that's where my dad grew up, and that was their church. And then they had a little store in the corner across from the parish house. First was the store, and then the school was next, a little ways over. And that store was first run by a Schmalz family, which was, Mrs. Schmalz was a neighbor to my dad where he grew up. She was a former Reinbold. And later on, when we went to school there, Turnus family had the store. And that was just like a little village. And where the parish house was, had a nice little wood fence around the yard, and there was mailboxes, I would say about 20, 25 of them. That whole Krasna community got their mail, had to come up to the church to get their mail. Almost all the parishioners that went to church there, the mail carrier would come by our farm up to the church a mile, deliver that mail for all those 20 boxes, whatever was there, and then he'd go east and work his way back into Strasbourg.
It was a lot quicker that way.
It was, yeah. It was faster that way. And Dad always enjoyed farming, and he raised shorthorn cattle.
Was that common? Did a lot of people do the shorthorn cattle? Okay.
Some did, not mostly Herefords though, beef cattle. And we had the shorthorn beef cattle, and then he added milk cows. They had two strains. That was beef cattle and milking shorthorn. And the milking shorthorn, they gave quite a bit of milk. Maybe not quite as much as a Holstein, but they were pretty good. But man, could they kick. Oh, they were kind of on the wild side. I don't know. I think when we milked, some years we had a fourth of them that we'd have to tie their legs or put hobbles on them so they couldn't kick so easy. And some of them you couldn't even put the chains on. And they had little hooks on the end, and the chain came across, and you hooked it on the other leg, and then you could tighten it. The chain you could pull up and lock it in. And on some, that wouldn't even work. You had to use a rope so you were sure it was going to stay there.
Oh, wow.
And they would kick so easy. And they just, when they kicked and reached out, they grabbed you, and you were standing a couple of feet away from them. Their legs just stretched all the way. And so it was kind of dangerous, And others were gentle then and quite tame. But, yeah, we milked some of those. And they were good milk producers, and sometimes even the ones that were beef cattle, they produced more milk than they needed for their calf a lot of times. And so Dad would milk them from the beginning, and us girls would help too. Milk them whatever the calf wouldn't use up during that day. Once a day we'd milk them until the calf was older, and then they could handle it. So I always teased my husband when we got married. He'd always kind of joke about the whole shorthorns. They were a little more timid. They were not quite as tough as a Hereford cow. And they had the Herefords for their beef herd. And then later on I said, that's why you have a good Hereford herd. Mine cows produce more milk. And so as we milked them for a while and then crossbred them with Herefords, but they milked a lot better than the Herefords did. And I said, that's where we got our good Hereford herd from. The shorthorn had to help along.
Were there ever any serious accidents with the cows kicking?
Hmm. They'd take after you once in a while. You'd have to take a run and get up higher, but otherwise we never had a bad accident. There were some close calls once in a while, and most of those were kind of just lately also, where the cattle are crossbred with Charolais, and what's the other one, Simmental? And which one is it? The Charolais, I think, is a little wilder. Well, she's just a better mother, protects her calf a little more, so you have to be careful how close you get. And if she thinks you're after her calf, she'll be after you. And they had to watch those real close the last few years that Daryl is farming now, our son. He had a close shave about a year ago. Last spring would be about a year ago, when he went in and was going to move the calf a little bit, and the cow thought he was going to take it. She came after him, and she bumped him, and as he was going to get away, he also slipped, and I guess she attacked him some, and he thought, uh-oh, that's the end of me. And she passed him then and came back again.
Gave him time to get away.
Yeah, but he didn't get away. But she turned around so close to him that by the time he thought he'd get away, she was there again and ran over him and kind of stepped on his thigh or whatever. She hit him a little bit. He was quite sore, but he said, I never thought I'd get through that one. That was the closest one he ever had. And so we never really had a big accident, which I'm surprised, because we had 5 boys, and they all had to be taught how to run tractors and how to be careful around the cattle. But they got chased a few times and so, but otherwise, and they tipped, Leo tipped a tractor one time. It came out of the corral, and it was built up, the barn was built up on dirt that they hauled in, because we lived so close to the creek. And because of the flood, they raised the dirt a little bit and then built the barn. And so it was slanted in front of the barn, and he came out of the corral and came over too far, and the tractor just leaned over. And the good thing we had this big cottonwood there, it just leaned against that. So nobody got hurt. And then Jeff and Ellen were cleaning kind of the feedlot, and it was on a side hill. And then Jeff's tractor, he had a load on the farmhand, I guess, and it was a little bit lopsided. And all of a sudden that leaned over. And Ellen said, boy, I'd never seen anybody jump like a rabbit, but Jeff did that day. And he got off of it then. And nothing broke, so he wouldn't have got hurt anyway. So.
Still a little scary.
It is. Mm-hmm. And then Leo was working on the farmhand one time, and he had a spring bolt with a spring, and he was taking that off, and that slipped out earlier than he thought it would. I didn't think he had this bolt turned out that far. And then the bolt came loose, and the combine came up, the hitch came up and hit him on the head and knocked him flat on his back. And then he came in, it was all red, and then it started swelling. Oh, never knew a forehead could swell like that because there's nothing there. But boy, did he have a head. And then, and just a little bruise. But he felt okay and had somewhat of a headache for a little while. And then I talked to Dr. Orchard, and he said, well, just watch him. If headache gets worse, that'll come in. And if not, if it stays like that, it's okay. You should just rest and take aspirin, which he did. Then he fell one time. That was the toughest one we had, I guess, over all the years. They were putting in the calf to give a shot. It had something they needed a shot for. And they brought it up, and 2 of the boys were out there with him, and had roped it, and were putting the rope around the post to pull it in, and the rope slipped on Jeff. Jeff was going to hold it, and it slipped on him, and then the calf had too much of a rope, and started running and ran, and the rope went across Leo's chest and knocked it back into the feed bunk and fell across. There was a bar with little stands that we put on the end of the bunk, and fell on one of those iron bars with the back of his head and knocked him out. And then he got up, took that rope and pulled the calf in, and Jeff would hold it, and Leo gave the calf the shot, and they let it loose, took it off then from the rope and let her out and run her down the runway to the lot where they were. Came back to the barn, and Leo says to the boys, what are these pigs doing in here? Well, they said, we put them in this morning. One of them was sick. Then he walked away and, what are these calves doing here? Well, that's what we just did. We brought some of them in and put them in for the night, and he couldn't remember that. Then the boys started looking at each other, and they were wondering what the heck's the matter with Dad. And as they came from the barn to the house, they walked by the truck. And Leo said, what's this white truck doing here? Whose is that? Well, you and Mom were at Mobridge the other day. You brought it home. That's not our truck. You guys must be crazy, he said. And the boys said again, yeah, you and Mom, you bought that truck. That's our truck. And they went into the house, and took their clothes off, and when he walked upstairs, Renee was behind him. She was with them too when this happened. He went down the back of his hips like that with his hands. What the heck, why do I have my billfold in my pocket? Well, Renee said to him, you were over at Noel's this morning and you picked up some eggs, and that's when you picked up your billfold. You're nuts, I wasn't at Noel's today. Why would I go over there? He said, it's a Saturday, that's when we have work to do, you know. Yeah, but you were over there, you brought home some eggs, and came upstairs, sat on the chair, and he looked at me, and he said, why can't I remember? And I said, well, I don't know, but Renee had, when he was undressing downstairs, she came up and she told me, she said, Dad got hurt, but don't worry, Mom, he's okay. And I said, well, how can he be okay when he's hurt? Well, he's not hurt. I don't know how to say this, she said, but he's okay. But he did fall. Now when he came up and asked me, why can't I remember? And then I said to Renee, did he fall on his head? And she said, yeah, he hit that bar. And, oh man, we answered questions that night. From 6 o'clock on until about 10, till he finally wore out, and then we convinced him to go lay down. And I had called Dr. Orchard. And Dr. Orchard said, does he know you? Yeah, he knows me. Does he know the kids' names? Yes, he seems to know them and calls them by their name. Well, then maybe it's not as bad as it could be. But it could be that he couldn't remember anything. And I stood there a while and I said, what do you mean? Nothing. Yes, he said he has to learn over to learn what he knew. I thought, oh, gee. And I says to Dr. Orchard, do you mean not even that he married me? Yes, he said. I thought, well, that'll be a tough one. But as time went on, and then that evening, we wanted him to lay down. It's about 9 o'clock. And he went in, laid down, and he just couldn't rest. Came back out, and he says, I can't figure out why I can't remember. And we tried to tell him that he fell and got hurt. And so he questioned us again until 10 o'clock, and then he finally had a dip of ice cream and went back in and lay down. Then he fell asleep. But he also worried we had a heifer that was coming in. And that he remembered that he had put that one in the barn. And I told him not to worry. We had Dr. Janisek was our neighbor, and he was a good veterinarian, and we were good friends with him. And so I said, I've already called Don, and he said he'll come over and take care of it. Okay, so he went and laid down. Then he could rest. And Alex Nagel, my cousin's son, he was the second cousin to the kids, came that evening. And he and Renee were going to go to town, but they didn't go then because Leo had that fall. And then Alex was a comfort to us. His dad had an experience like that. So he said to Renee, your mom shouldn't worry that much because his dad had the same, and it took several days until some of his memory came back. And to this day, there's 15 minutes, Leo cannot remember, roping that calf, giving it the shot, and letting it go again. That is still missing. And along the line, there's a lot of times he'll come and question me. Well, now, didn't we do this, or when did we buy this, like insurance or whatever? But I am glad that his memory came back well enough that he can do our financial work, and he follows up everything now. From the beginning, he questioned a lot to make sure. And he had hauled wheat a week before that fall, and there was one slip he was missing. And then he asked if I remember whether he took any wheat to town that day, and I remembered. But he wouldn't believe me. I told him that he took that load in, I remember, and it was a full load because he wasn't finished yet with it. Would not believe that I was right until we found that slip finally. He dug it out of some jacket or where it was stuck in, and then he could put it together. And one of our friends asked him afterwards, well, if you couldn't remember a lot of the stuff, how do you know? Yeah, he says, I still don't know. I just have to believe what they tell me. And sometimes that wasn't easy for him to trust what we said,
Yeah.
And And then that was years afterwards. He'd go to town and somebody would walk up, call him by his name, and they would talk about school and or whatever else they did. And he'd come home and say, "Now I saw so-and-so in town today. He was about so tall, and his hair was such and such a color and all that." And sometimes I could guess who that could have been or which family from where he was from, but sometimes I couldn't. And then sometimes if I could put it together and then, oh yeah, I think I remember we did go to school together, you know. A lot of this they had to learn over. Oh, that was an experience, I'm telling you.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Wow. Can you tell me what kind of a man your father was? What he was like?
Okay, we started that a while ago. I got lost on it. I saw him as a very good person. He was a very good family man, concerned, and he had 6 daughters and only 1 son. And so he had to do all his farming with just the help of the daughters. And we managed real well. My second oldest sister was his right hand. Ever Dad went out to work, she'd be the one to go with him and help. If they needed extra help, then I had to go. And if they didn't need me, and then I helped Mom. So I was kind of in between, you know, either here or there. Excuse me. And that worked out really good. And my sister and I got along real well, and we worked well together. Dad would always tease we were his set of donkeys. He could send us wherever. We didn't matter. We didn't care where we were sent. We would just do what we needed to do. And that worked out very well. And he never mistreated us or got angry at us. I can't ever remember that he would scold. If something broke, well, it broke. You fixed it, and he would help us. A lot of times Mom would say, "Well, now you send them off and you didn't tell them this or that." He'd just kind of chuckling. "Oh, they'll find out when it breaks, you know, they'll either fix it or bring it home." And he didn't worry that we couldn't help ourselves. And as we worked with him, we watched and were careful of what he was doing, so we learned from him. And we remembered what he did, so we did it too. And sometimes you goof off a little bit and have a little accident, but we never had anything bad happen. I think the one thing that kind of scared us a little bit, we were going out the field and a roll of binder twine fell off, and it rolled out in front of, and it fell down in front of the wheel. And so all of a sudden this tractor comes up on one side. These bales were about that tall, you know, and that was quite a hump. It went over that, and it scared us a little bit. I was standing on the drawbar, and my sister was driving. And what was that? And we looked around, and there was this binder twine laying. So we picked it up, but nobody got hurt. And Dad was a good mechanic. He did his own repair. He repaired the cars and the tractors also. And Viola and one of us would always be with him and help. Viola was sick a lot, my sister. That was right after me. And so many times I helped Dad because she was sick. And as a small child, she always cried a lot, Mom said. And as she got older, she had a lot of times when she wasn't feeling good, and she'd have abdominal pain a lot. So later on, they found out she had female problems.
That's why she didn't feel good.
That's right. And she did have surgery to have her ovaries removed. And when we worked with Dad, he would just show us what to do, and we'd grind valves and everything for him. Wash off the parts with gasoline and a brush and clean them up. And so that's what we did, yeah. And when it was corn picking time, we picked corn by hand, and we always helped him with that. Anything that had to be done, we were always out with him. Yeah, he was a very good person. He provided for us, and we never had to be cold or without clothing or whatever. Always were comfortable. And he worried a lot during the 30s that, there wasn't enough income hardly sometimes and shortage of everything. Then the war broke out and then everything was rationed then. And he was not as hard on shoes as I was, so I'd always use one of his stamps in between because I needed an extra pair of shoes. I don't know why, but my shoes would always wear out much sooner than anybody else's.
Even your sisters.
Right, even my sisters. And so when I needed another pair of shoes, and then Dad didn't need one pair, so I did his stamp and did my shoes. And then I guess too with girls, see, Dad would wear the shoes that were ankle high, the black ones, and then he'd buy a good pair for Sundays. Years ago, you all did that. And have Sunday shoes, they weren't good enough for Sunday, he'd wear them for every day. So he could use his shoes. And that were a woman, you have your dress shoes. Well, you can't wear heels to the farm. And that's where I needed more shoes, I guess, is I needed a pair of work shoes and had used mine for a pair of dress shoes already on my stamp.
And your dress shoes couldn't become work shoes afterward.
Work shoes, that's where I was missing extra stamp,
I suppose.
I needed one.
You said your father, you don't remember him scolding, yelling. Mm-hmm. How was he when he wanted to show love or that he was proud of you? What would he do?
I don't know, he was just satisfied and that you didn't get a special treat if he was satisfied. He would never complain, that you didn't do things right as long as you did them okay, you were all right.
He was just all around pretty easygoing.
Mm-hmm, pretty easygoing. And I cannot remember that anybody was treated because you did well, like nowadays a lot of times I know, okay, if you do this or that, you'll get maybe $100 or whatever. That wasn't years ago. You just did your thing, and maybe some people treated them special, but it was just they would say that they were